We're moving from a detection panel. We moved from a detection panel to a communication panel, reaching the public. And now we're entering a decision panel. How do you decide in the fog of uncertainty? And of course, these long duration crises that we are interested in today really force us to rethink the decision phase of crisis management, if there's such a thing as a phase, but decision making during crises, because there's not one or even 4 or even 20 decisions to make in a 24-hour period. There are many over, in this case, an 18-month, 22-month, 3-year period. So we have to rethink that, and we have to rethink how we think about organizing for effective crisis decision making. So we have a distinguished panel here today, both live and online. I will introduce them in the order that they're in the program. So Dana Dolan is joining us from the Washington, D.C. area, I presume, since you're affiliated with George Mason University. Dana Dolan is working with, has submitted a memo on the multiple streams framework, Kingdon's famous framework, and how the different streams in that framework have to be adapted for an era of I think you call them slow emergencies, Dana. We call them creeping crises, but we're all on the same page, more or less, I'm happy to say about that. And it's really a fascinating memo. We also have José Kerstholt, who's from the University of Twente in the Netherlands, working on human decision-making, the role of emotions and intuitions, and how certain biases affect decision-making and responses. Also an excellent memo focused on how to make better decisions, perhaps through modeling, and what are the pros and cons of modeling decisions. And who do we include in those modeling decisions? We have Professor Giliberto Capano from Bologna, who is a full professor of political science and public policy, also formerly dean of the campus, and Federico Toth, also from Bologna, also a full professor, working on decision-making dynamics. I didn't follow the order of the program, in fact, because Jane Swift, who joins us from the United States. Jane, can you hear us okay? Great. It's really a privilege to welcome Jane to the panel. Jane is one of the few chief executives, in a sense, that can join us today, who has chief executive experience of decision-making during crisis, having been the governor of the state of Massachusetts, which in European terms is like being the prime minister of a Nordic country with 7 million people in the state of Massachusetts. So Jane, if you don't mind, I use your first name, but Jane Swift was one of the youngest governors when she took office, and that was during 9/11. So as a governor during 9/11, she has firsthand experience of what it's like to be in the hot seats in the decision-making room. So it'll be absolutely fantastic and a treasure to be able to hear your reflections and your experience actually there, which very few of us can match. But why don't we, in fact, try to keep with the order that I've already violated by beginning with Dana from Washington. And then, and what we'd like to do is make just 5 minutes or so to get things kick-started. So if you have lots of points and lots of interesting ideas, let's save some of those for the discussion, because we do have good discussions so far. So that was, so we'll just kind of kick things open with a 5-minute startup from everyone, and then we'll bring in the audience, and Arjen Boyne is here next to me, so together we can throw in a few questions which are burning in our minds after we've read the memos. But so let's go ahead and get started. Dana, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here today. It's really a chilly Washington, D.C. morning. But I wanted to start by saying a few words, not so much about what I wrote in the 2-page memo, which was written before I had a chance to see what the other panelists would be talking about, but to try to redirect those comments a little bit towards intersections of our discussions. So starting off, looking at the name of this panel, it's Deciding in the Fog of Uncertainty. But I'd like to suggest that the fog of ambiguity is an even deeper challenge for us, because ambiguity, unlike uncertainty, can't be reduced by gathering more information or waiting for more time to pass. In fact, that can actually deepen ambiguity. And I define this as this type of ambivalence that's created when there are many competing ways of thinking about a situation or a phenomenon. Then I also want to think about the word deciding. And in my case, deciding is the focus very much on making public policy choices. So there are lots of different theories of the policy process, but there's really only one that highlights ambiguity as a fundamental characteristic of public policy making rather than an exceptional situation, and that's the multiple streams framework. So recent studies, very recent studies, have applied this to COVID and, of course, climate change for a number of years now. So I think this fits really well with the creeping crisis concept. And I used it out of my work came the idea of slow emergencies, which is very similar. So I actually framed my work around the idea of decision-making for long-term governance issues, more specifically looking at a case of climate change adaptation. And I found inspiration for this work from work from political scientists like Alan Jacobs, Rob DeLeo, and Jonathan Boston, who were focusing on long-term or anticipatory types of policy issues. And I'll add that there was a 2001 paper on slow onset harms that was Ariane Boyen and Paul Tahart, their work, and that really helped me get through some of the conflicting problems I was having applying the multiple streams framework. But for a really long time, I resisted drawing on any disaster or crisis literature because it seemed to me that the emphasis was too much on reactive decision-making rather than proactive decisions. So I'm really pleased to see that this idea of creeping crisis has come along, which I think hits that middle ground that's been missing. So I wanted to specifically address two of the questions that the conference organizers posed. The first was, why do political actors fail to recognize clear signals of emerging threats? And the second is, why do they fail to act on clearly articulated warnings? And I think the multiple streams framework can address both of these relatively easily. If you think about these questions, they start with this expectation that something is clear, either signals or warnings, depending on the question you're looking at. So this is an assumption that these signals exist and that there's some right way of understanding them, and that generally people agree on what that way of understanding is. But that's clearly not how ambiguity works. And that's the kind of recognition that's really baked into the multiple streams framework. So without going into any further detail on multiple streams framework, which many of you already know, my point here is that we have a lot of existing models like the multiple streams framework, but certainly others that can be adapted in some way to make them more applicable to these ideas like creeping crisis. And I think that can go both ways in helping us understand the concepts of creeping crisis, but also in helping us really develop these models into a more realistic view of public policy that can give us better insights into even the more normal way of making decisions. So that's basically what I do with the multiple streams framework and the case that I use in my book. So the points I wanted to raise to connect with the other speakers here are really come down to three things. The first challenge is understanding the interactions that take place between slow and sudden onset harms. And I think we heard quite a bit about this in both the previous panels. But what I want to focus on is that these aren't like two dichotomous categories. It's a whole spectrum. So what we're really trying to look at are comparing and contrasting and looking at the interactions between slower and faster processes and the intersection between these two. The second challenge I want to raise is understanding the interactions, this time between physical harms and socially constructed harms, if that's the right word to use. Examples of that first category would be things like hurricanes and floods, things that physically threaten lives or damage buildings or whatever. But the threat of future harm, the kinds of things that I study with long-term governance and climate change, and we can argue COVID fits in there as well, depending on how we're looking at it, are socially constructed crisis. And these two different categories often appear together For example, climate change can fuel extreme weather events. So these two things occur together. One can cause the other, one can serve as a precursor to the other. But how we think about them separately, distinguishing them, and how we think about the interactions between those two things are still challenges that we have to address. So what makes them distinct can have implications for how we treat them, both in practice and as objects of research. And that brings me to the third challenge, which is if we want to gain a better understanding of these first two challenges, we not only need more attention, more research to these problems, but also more minds at work. We need researchers with the skills in things like concept development and qualitative methods and interpretation who can actively engage with these abstract, compounding, cross-boundary issues. And at least in the United States, the emphasis is very heavily still on quantitative reasoning and quantitative methods in the classroom, things like that. So a question for this group to think about as things move forward is really how could we participate in bringing in a new generation of scholars to join the cause of understanding the challenges that we have. With that, I'd like to just thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dana. It's wonderful to see the multiple streams framework being applied to these questions, right? And I agree with you. It really can account for time processes and it account for ambiguity really well. And when we're talking about creeping crises or slow emergencies, that's really what we're talking about to a great extent. Let me hand it over to José.
Thank you very much. So I'm a psychologist and specialized in human decision making. So that's also the frame I look at this COVID crisis. Well, you probably all know that human decision making is far from optimal when it comes to decision making in new situations. We mostly rely on previous experiences, on our knowledge when we make decisions, and that people are not very good at decision making in new situations, but they mostly rely on experience and previous and their knowledge, on their intuitions and gut feelings, and that cannot be used in a new situation like the COVID crisis we are experiencing. And in that situation, people need to go more to analytic decision making. So they have to make trade-offs, very difficult trade-offs between, for example, effects on healthcare, on social issues, economics, and people are not very good at making these trade-offs. In fact, they try to avoid making trade-offs, and then they go into heuristic decision-making or rule-based decision-making. For example, we just focus on the health domain, and particularly intensive care, for example. And if that is within particular bounds, then we may look at a social domain or the economic domain. So that is more of a rule-based decision-making, and it's not making the trade-offs between all domains that are affected. So I think that one of the research issues should be that we learn more about how experienced decision-makers, policy-makers make those decisions and how we can support those decisions. But perhaps even more important is how we make experienced policymakers aware that their decision-making abilities are limited. And that was also said this morning. We, for example, have developed a model, a causal model, describing all kinds of relationships between factors that are relevant in this crisis across domains. And such a model supports in creating shared understanding, because all stakeholders are making this model together. And it also supports in reasoning about the effects of particular interventions. So you could say, if I change that factor, how does that affect all other domains? And policymakers were really enthusiastic about this model and creating this model. But when it came to interventions, they were very reluctant to use such a model, and they wanted to rely on their own gut feeling. So they trusted their gut feeling more than this analytic model. And I think that is a very important assumption, that people are willing to use the support that we are providing them for more analytic decision making. My second point relates to what the previous speaker was saying as well, and that is that the decision-making cycle mostly starts when there is an actual crisis, and mostly a physical crisis, like a pandemic or a flooding or whatever. Whereas this physical crisis interacts with the creeping crises that are already there in society. For example, reduced trust in science or governments, or polarization or inequalities. And this physical crisis interacts with those processes. And I think that we should start more in the preparation phase to learn about these interactions between these creeping processes and a physical crisis. And we cannot model all crises that may occur, we don't know, but we can model the effects and we can model the interactions, and we are able to do something about it before a crisis occurs. So I think we should do more in the preparation phase concerning those interactions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jose. Jane Swift, Governor Swift. So how does it really work?
So
tell us your experience and see where it conflicts or coincides with what we're talking about.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a huge honor. I'm not sure I have done such academic work probably since I was in college, which is a long time ago. I think that irony here is this sort of contradiction and dichotomy where a creeping crisis or a slow onset crisis from an academic standpoint and in the rearview mirror appears to have developed very slowly. But when you are a leader in the midst of a crisis, decisions have to be made really quickly. And the velocity of information that occurs in today's media climate, both correct information and incorrect information, is, I think, one of the things that I would hope we could update models to provide those structures to support those who are practicing leadership in a crisis, which every single elected official will at some point in some way process. And so, and then the other piece is similar with all of our mediums. So I can be on a conference now in the Netherlands, and then in an hour I will be doing a board meeting. Lots of experts, and what in the literature, Professor Boyne and some of his co-authors have previously called elites, are available, like the folks on this call, to lend support, but they generally are outside of the decision-making framework and the structure of what elected officials would access. And so I think the second problem for those who are in a leadership position is they get lots of inbound opportunities to access experts or elites, but there are two problems, and I'd be interested in Dana's perspective on this from the United States. Problem number one is we are going through a political climate where experts and elites are no longer seen as the be-all, end-all. And in fact, in some cases in the media and in society, experts and elites are not listened to at all. The second part for the leader is, how do you know in a very fast-moving decision-making process, who are legitimate experts who have the right information, and how can you access that? So I would love to have, or would have loved to have when I was governor, for particularly the decision-making phase where there is so much uncertainty and you cannot have all the information. I think there are two contributions that could be made to the structure of decision-making. One would be a updated frame of how to leverage communication and to account for disinformation, to account for those individuals who are putting out information that is incorrect. It's an issue we are grappling with. And so it's not just stand and deliver information that a leader can do to update the public, but the public is getting information from many other sources, some legitimate, some illegitimate. And so I think updating the framework around communication to account for the explosion of media sources and information, so that there's a playbook, if you will, on dealing with disinformation and breaking through with credible information. The second piece would be a construct for how someone assembles a new team of subject matter experts in the midst of a crisis. Most elected officials have people who are point within their administration that are the expert in an area, but the complexity of the society that we live in and many other factors will result in crises like COVID, where no one within your trusted circle will have all of the correct information. And so how do you assemble and process lots of information from experts in a way that is usable and trustworthy by the person who's deciding? And then lastly, I think we have to replace the concept of elites and experts somehow with a ability to validate information and a construct that helps to utilize expertise in a way that can be trusted by the public. So I hope, and then I guess the one thing, and this I'll end where I started, the crises like climate change, certainly COVID, in retrospect, certainly were creeping, but the velocity of change in society, where a virus can spread from one continent to another in an extraordinarily fast time frame, is a fundamental mismatch with the speed at which government makes decisions. And so this issue around the collision between the velocity of change that's happening in our technologically advanced society and the pace at which government is designed to work and thoughtful decisions, that's not a contradictory term for government, but thoughtful decisions are being made, presents a real challenge, both in crisis, frankly, and in day-to-day governing. And as just an example, we'll have self-driving cars on the road before any state has figured out how, from a technology standpoint and a governance standpoint, to regulate that industry from a safety or even a zoning and planning standpoint.
Excellent. Thank you very much for looking back and looking forward. And some of the challenges ahead of us will resemble some of these slow emergencies or creeping crises, and how do we update our understanding of those and our structures? You're talking about the input, structuring the input of expertise and knowledge into the political process. How do we do that in an era also of discommunication, miscommunication, and and fake news and the whole business. Speaking of dilemmas, of course, we have our Giliberto and Federico, our two Italian professors here, to talk about the various dilemmas facing policymakers. And also a nice memo, because towards the end there you actually take some hard stands on what decision makers should do. And some of them are kind of controversial as well, as to under conditions of uncertainty, facing brutal dilemmas, what they should actually do. So enlighten us on that.
Thanks a lot, Mark. We are two, because we were joking with Mark, not because we are two Italian carabinieri. We have a lot of jokes in Italy about carabinieri, but because I'm in public policy and Federico is in organization theory, so we have tried to mix our knowledge. We have the right to have 10 minutes, so I will try to stay in 4 minutes to give more time. I'm not sure. Let's to give more time to Federico, who is going to speak about the lessons. Okay, we have tried to focus on the topic decided under fog, and we have added time pressure. Why? Because we think that all in all, we know there has been a big discussion about preparation, not preparation, about the fact that some countries immediately react, other countries were more slow. There is and this is something that should be discussed. And I hope during this day there has been the situation that many countries have been delaying a lot. There has been this kind of collective denial with respect to this fact. However, at a certain point in all the countries, decision makers should decide, because it was quite clear that we have something here that entered our country. According to the debates and observers, when the decision maker realized that they had a problem, they had at least two dilemmas. We define them apparent dilemmas. We are talking about the dilemma, the economy versus public health, the dilemma, individual freedom versus societal safety, and so on. Our, I would say, statement provocation is that they have been, in most of the cases, apparent dilemmas, in the sense that in all the countries, except probably Sweden, Brazil, and initially US with Trump and the UK with Johnson, all the countries have tried to, all the decision makers in all the countries have tried to frame these two horns in a way or another, to build up a coherent, according to the context, narrative to link together the horn of the dilemma. The same we would like to have, this leads us to think about another apparently dilemmatic choice that regards the first response. We had this divide in the literature about suppression. We have summarized it: let's kill it, let's kill the virus, or mitigation, or let's try to live with it. This is another statement or another provocation. We think that the choice among the two strategies has not been driven by an autonomous decision, but it has been simply obliged by time and perception of the risk. Time in the sense that the sooner you have recognized the virus, then you have tried to go for suppression and so on. And the perception of the risk, because also the type of strategy chosen among the two depends on the perception of the risk of the leader and also of the country. When you have to decide in the fog, you have substantially to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity. We have defined in a very simple way these two concepts in which there is a huge literature. Uncertainty is the lack of appropriate knowledge on problem solutions, causal effect relationship, and we can consider it like a technical dimension, is something of objective, while ambiguity is assumes that there could be many different interpretations of the problem, solutions, and so on, and so it's the subjective dimension, the value-driven dimension, the political dimension. So what happened according to our way of thinking during the crisis? First of all, that we assume that, okay, we get out from the fog by diminishing uncertainty and ambiguity, but is this really true? Because it's clear that initially there were both high uncertainty and high ambiguity. And when we say uncertainty, we underline also that was uncertainty not only in decision maker, but also in the experts. Then uncertainty has been decreasing. We started to know better what the virus was, how it works. So we started to have more knowledge about how to fight it from the health point of view. So therapies, vaccine. So we have decreased uncertainty, but not necessarily ambiguity has decreased, because more information, which means less uncertainty, has increased ambiguity. A lot of discussion about, and now that we have the vaccine, what can we do? And so ambiguity, different interpretation of the situation, is not decreased, but has increased. Why uncertainty has diminished, ambiguity has usually increased? Quite simple, we think, because when people feel less threatened, it's clear that we are not under pressure, and so you can start to say what you really think. And then we have seen the real negative socio-economic effects of the crisis. So, all in all, our third statement or provocation is that in getting out of the fog, yes, uncertainty tends to diminish, but ambiguity not necessarily tends to diminish. And this could be a problem for the following step. According to this, I would say, statement, thought, now Federico will go through some lessons. How many minutes?
5-ish. Yeah. Oh, of yours, right? That's not bad. Yeah.
We ran out of time.
Very good.
So I jump in.
Yes.
And the idea that all over the world, the national government has to tackle similar apparent or real dilemmas. So similar or, almost the same challenges. And our argument is that all the strategies that have been adopted in order to tackle these challenges, all the policy responses, has advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons. And so we repeat the expression, yes, they are good, but they have, of course, counter effect we have to be aware of. We focus in particular on 5, let's say, very widely accepted recommendations that, according to us, have positive effect. They are not wrong, but they have positive effect, but at the same time, they can also have negative effects. First one, we are discussing this morning, rely on previous similar experience. Of course, it's important to take stock of previous experience, and nevertheless, proceeding by analogy can be misleading, because, of course, each crisis is different from the other. So you can, of course, use previous tools that are not, of course, effective anymore. Secondly, it is certainly important, and we discussed this in the morning talking about communication. Before communicate, you have to meaning making. So political leaders must be able to meaning making. It means provide an authoritative account of what is going on and what needs to be done. Yes, it is important. Nevertheless, these 2 recommendations, so the idea of meaning making and even the idea of using or relying on previous similar experiences, they both simplify the problem or tend to simplify the problem. Even meaning making means framing the problem. Framing is by definition a selection of elements to take into consideration. And this, of course, could be effective, especially in the short run, but maybe they are, counterproductive. They can be a boomerang in the medium or in the long term. Because the problem of the dilemma, if you opt only for one horn of the dilemma and you completely neglect the other horns of the dilemma, then you will pay the bill sooner or later. Third recommendation, ask the expert. If you are in uncertainty conditions and you are a decision maker, ask the expert. And the expectation is that expert, scientists, will provide you the right answer and unambiguous indications. But in many countries, we have experienced exactly the opposite. Experts disagree. And so we have witnesses in many countries a battle among experts, what has been called in literature, politics of expertise. And this is very important to take into account. Fourth recommendation, the diversity of experts. And this, of course, is something really good to take into account because, of course, it's important to avoid groupthink and to avoid cognitive pitfalls. Nevertheless, gathering new information and trying to rely on different sources of different disciplines of diverse experts at the same time increases ambiguity by definition, because different perspective and the diversity of experts provide you different interpretation of the problem. So ambiguity maybe is going to increase in this way. And finally, the fifth recommendation, we are going to discuss it in the section to come, but is centralize. Centralize expertise and centralize decision making. So it's much more practical to have just one expert at national level and to follow the advice of the single expert. And in general, it is assumed that it is a widely held belief that there must be just one man in charge. The government just must speak just with one voice. And military style, command and control mode, it's appropriate in order to tackle emergency. But we have experienced that the center, the national government, in many countries, probably everywhere, sometimes makes wrong decisions because they did not have the right pieces of knowledge. And the right pieces of knowledge, on the contrary, were found in peripheral nodes. So the idea that the knowledge is not concentrated in the center, but is dispersed all over the network, and you have to search for the person that have the right solution and has the right knowledge. I don't know if I am out of time. Just to conclude with a literary image taken from the novel written by Lev Tolstoy, War and Peace, and in particular the description of the Battle of Borodino. There was a very funny description of both Napoleon on the French side and General Kutuzov on the Russian one. And the description made by Lev Tolstoy was Napoleon thinks he was in charge. Nevertheless, he was so far away from the heat of the battle, from the center of the battle, that when the orders of Napoleon arrived, it was too late. And in the meantime, the soldiers on the front line has already done something. So if they were scared, they go back. If they were confident, they go ahead. If it is possible to take the bridge, they do so. And so in the end, Napoleon pretended to be in charge, and we think that it is important, the strategy and the decision made by the center, by the general. But actually, this is not the case. I stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Everyone within time, everyone with a lot of terrific points, and there's a lot of overlap in the discussion too, with uncertainty and ambiguity. That several writers brought that one up. Centralization versus decentralization, the pros and the cons. So Governor Swift asked for a structure for the kind of input of expertise from people where everyone has a different kind of expertise. How do you bring those together to provide a decision maker with as full a picture as possible, knowing that possibly what we've heard today is maybe by definition very, very difficult, because you don't know where the expertise is. It might be further down the line, it might be on the periphery of decision maker elites. So as soon as you build those structures, you've centralized, and centralization has its drawbacks, as was just put forward. There's also the discussion about the link between the actual event itself and other kinds of issues, other kinds of problems which arise. We heard the words the physical event from both Dana and José about there's the physical event, but then there's the knock-on effects in the social aspects. So if we have vulnerability in society, if we have other problems in society that are exacerbated by these different crises, are decision makers taking those into account? So a lot of terrific points to be made and reflected upon. We can open it up to our audience at home, our audience, I don't know what's home anymore, here physically, virtually, outside. But why don't we tackle some of those questions, and maybe the panel participants also have questions for each other. I mean, I think...
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, please.
So I'm really interested in this idea that there exists peripheral information, right? That the right information has been found to exist, but it's on the periphery. And my question is, if we can't design the system that I covet, can we at least segment when that information is in the peripheral, whether it's within government or outside of government? And so just in addition to defining like the time span of crisis, I think we're in a societal situation where we also need to define types of crisis in addition to physical and social. Some of these are so highly complex and solutions are going to demand such specific expertise that I think it's unlikely that information would be within government. And so maybe if we defined which type of crisis a leader needed to look for information on the periphery outside of his organization versus inside his organization, that would at least give a starting point for how to find the right expert. Does that make sense?
It does, it does. And of course, the dilemma is as soon as you start to define the kind of crisis, then you've already limited yourself to known crisis and not the next one. I remember hearing about solutions, and I think some of our crisis management practitioners and trainers and academics can weigh in on this one, about the importance of having people connected to leadership settings, which can go out and marshal the information and the knowledge needed for that particular event. And I think they called them something like rapid reflection teams or something. So people who could go out there, quickly mobilize, think out of the box about what might be needed, think about where expertise may reside that nobody has thought about for this particular event. It came up after the van shooting in Washington, D.C. about 20 years ago, where the person left tarot cards as evidence with every murder that he did. And it turns out that the person who knew what that pattern of tarot cards was some eccentric person in a basement somewhere. But he was located and he managed to solve the case. That's an extreme example. But it serves the exact same argument that Jane Swift put out, which is, we don't know where the knowledge is to support policymakers at any one moment and for any one particular crisis. So how do we organize that to be flexible, to be outside of the box, to be ready for the unexpected? So that's certainly, I think she asked for some help on that front. Now, Jose, you were working with TNO as well as University of Twente, so you suggest that there's an answer for these kinds of questions, I think, in terms of the modeling that can be brought, also in terms of, you emphasize the range of voices that have to be represented in these processes. Does that link to, is that a possible solution for what Governor Swift put out?
Where does this?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Well, that was basically about collaborative decision-making, where you bring together all the relevant expertise and create a model together, because you can have all the information, but it's also the question, how do you bring it together and make sense of the information? I think that is even more important. Sense-making is often more important than just having the information, because by sense-making, you're making intelligence of the data, and then it's actionable. You can do something about it. But I think it is surely for creative decisions, you should bring all these various disciplines together and think of other solutions than all the parties at the table would suggest from their own background. Mm-hmm. So I think surely in crises like COVID, more creative solutions could be found. And particularly if you have such a model, so you have a visualization of how the relations in the world look like, you are looking at the same picture rather than only the picture you have in your head yourself. And I think that facilitates or supports finding different solutions than the ones you would think of from your own background. But then you have this problem that people don't really believe the solutions a model gives and rather rely on their gut feeling.
Very good. I see Olivier beaming in from his locale in France, I believe.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I have a question actually regarding the notion of uncertainty, because for the moment, we've been addressing uncertainty in terms of, uncertainty regarding the virus. What we didn't know at the beginning about the virus, its characteristics, how it spreads, et cetera, et cetera. But what is interesting is that when countries like France, for instance, and others, Italy, Spain, decided to adopt a lockdown, a very strict lockdown, there was uncertainty, total uncertainty as to the effects of this measure. We didn't know if it would work. We didn't know how people would behave. We didn't know what would be the effects on the virus, but also the side effects. And clearly, in many cases, I mean, if you look at the models by Ferguson, he clearly says, we don't know what will be the effects of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, as he calls them, in very euphemism. But we don't know what will be the effects. But we choose to put that aside. Well, that's sort of a important decision, because you're putting aside something which could have important consequences, and actually has had important consequences. And moreover, so the rest of my question is, in your different countries, what has been done to try to measure these uncertainties, the consequences of the lockdown? In France, for instance, there was nothing put together to try to measure the consequences. So we still don't have any conclusive study that shows that lockdowns work. We think they work, but we don't know. We have no scientific study that shows they work. And we don't have also systematic studies about the consequences, social consequences, economic consequences, health consequences. But recent studies done by independent researchers show that actually the benefit risk of lockdowns is highly questionable. So I was wondering, how this question of uncertainty has been tackled in other countries. Both, how do you accept the idea that you're taking a measure that is highly uncertain, but that's a risk you're willing to take because there's a big threat. And how do you try to measure and reduce that uncertainty as the lockdown is being implemented? Thank you.
I think that measurement is key in a crisis like COVID, and I think that's also related to the fact that it's not a one-shot decision. It's like normally what you always also were saying, it's like a one cycle. You make a decision and then you have a solution. In this situation, there are many cycles. It's sequential decision making, and that may take a different type of decision making as well. It's not optimizing on one point in time, but what you can do, it's like controlling a system more like that, so you can make a small decision, then look at the effect, or you can do an experiment somewhere and look at the effects, and then you can gradually change your strategy, but you can continuously observe the effects on different domains if you measure. So measuring is key, and that's also what I thought was missing. That effects were not only obviously we had the measures from the hospitals and so on in the health domain, but not in the social domain. And I think that would have been key for another decision strategy.
I don't know, when you speak about lack of measurement of consequences, are you talking only about health consequences or also socio-economic consequences? Because
socioeconomic,
okay,
everything.
Because, talking from the health point of view, there was a certainty. If you didn't stop the diffusion of the virus, you could have a lot of problems. Let's try to come back to that time, because now we are after, we have, for example, clear empirical demonstration that if the Italian government had decided to introduce immediate lockdown in the close to Milano, in a province called Bergamo, we could have many, many deaths. So from this point of view, you had certainty, a lot of problems with okay, certainty, I can block the diffusion of the virus. Regarding the socio-economic problems, you know, and what I could react in this case. What was the empirical basis that has justified the fact, for example, that Sweden decided to go in that way or Brazil decided to go in that way in terms of socio-economic? In that moment, nobody had empirical evidence. All had some expert advice. So I think that we have to think in terms of decision maker dealing with these crazy problems in a context in which neither the expert have enough empirical evidence, you know what I mean? And so they are proposing their own personal view. May I just add a small point to reply to the governor? I think that it's not only a point of collaborative governance. I think that to try to avoid the Borodino situation, just to cite, we could design in different way decision, policy making processes and institutional functioning. We can train in people to think in another way. So I think that is not probably this the moment to discuss this, but we can design policies in a more robust way to allow more flexible or agile response. And we usually, for sure we could train people to thinking out of the box or to be capable to improvise. So I think that it could be possible. It's not probably this the panel to discuss about this. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Arjen?
I want to pick up on something that I think everybody's been saying and seeing if we can find a sort of common language for this, because it makes it a little easier maybe. If we start from the perspective that, you know, some poor people like Jane have to make decisions without having knowledge. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. And so Jane is essentially saying, you know, I don't know where these experts are, and find them for me. And if you can't find them for me, which is often hard enough, she still is going to have to make decisions. You know, so we can't wait for the right expert to arrive. And what I'm picking up here is Jose is saying, well, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, don't run too fast. Make small decisions, and then monitor the feedback. If I understand you correctly, and then just see what happens. We've seen another model, though. I mean, and let's call it sort of the precautionary principle idea. It's like, I have no idea what we're doing, but let's just make sure that we avoid the worst case. And so we just skip over a whole bunch of, you know, fuzzy gambling, and we just, you know, lock it all down. And so they're very different approaches, and you know, we've tried to summarize it, and in our next panel, Chris Ansel will come up, and he's going to talk about this in terms of pragmatist versus principle approaches. So you take a principle to get you out, you know, always go north, and we'll see, you know, that's a principle, whatever happens. Or, you know, just do something, stumble in the dark and see, you know, find the wall. And so Jane, so first of all, let's start with you, because do you recognize any of this when academics talk like that, or you're like, what the hell are they talking about?
So yes, but as you know, I recognize it after I left office better than when I was in office. But to the point of creating structures, and this is going to steal some of my thunder for Friday morning, but on 9/11, that was an unimaginable crisis that clearly no governor and no president had planned for the response. But interestingly, I think I've told you this, Professor Boyne, when I arrived with my public safety team, they had done a tabletop exercise that was related the week before about evacuating Boston. And so they were able to put in place, when I was out of communication for other reasons, like all the cell phones went down, there was no way to communicate, they had been able to take steps where they applied lessons they had trained for to a different crisis where the same response was necessary. And so that's what leads me to believing and endorsing what the other panelists are saying, that you can find these training constructs, and maybe it's teaching emergency response folks how to respond to, you guys will think of a better academic word, but the crisis that you could not have imagined, but the response, whether it's thinking out of the box or helping them to understand how you can apply different models, that I do think you could train the emergency response folks for, about when to use different responses, even if the crisis itself is different.
Thank you. So let's now continue. So our Italian friends looked at dilemmas, and did you see evidence of either way of dealing with these dilemmas, sort of trying little steps or taking sort of principled approaches? Does that ring true in
May I
your
start
analysis?
on this point? Because I ask your help, all the participants at the conference, because I have a conceptual problem that is the following. Dilemmas means trade-off, or they are two different things. I think they are two different things, but I need your help for that. So a dilemma can be defined as two or more options that are equally desirable but incompatible. So you have to take one, avoiding the other, neglecting the others. And so as a consequence of that, whatever you choose, you are wrong, you fail, if it is presented this way. So let's coming back to the question. If, first of all, when you are in a condition of uncertainty, you have to decide if you are really in a situation of dilemma. So are you really unable to balance the priority? Because sometimes you say, okay, it's an hard choice, okay, it's a dilemma, but it is not. Because if you think about that, you can say, this is more important, health, than, for example, economics. You can say that, the idea of principle. So the principles are leading. But in a real dilemma, this is not possible. They are equally desirable. So you are really in a problem. In a condition of uncertainty, first, if you do not have time pressure, take time. So maybe the solution is collect, gather information in order to reduce uncertainty. But unfortunately, on COVID-19, and in the last 2 years, we have experienced decisions that, on the contrary, cannot be delayed. And so you have to be on the spot, and you have to decide immediately. And all the countries that have decided later, that have took time, they do worse. So it is important, the time pressure. If you are under time pressure, and if you have asked the expert, but of course you don't know which experts are reliable and what are not, according to the definition I give, try to avoid extreme solutions, options that completely cut off the other horns of the dilemma. Otherwise, you will pay that. So try to make a trade-off in the dilemma. You know that you have to choose, but do not choose extreme strategy, but to choose something in the middle. That is not exactly proceeding incrementally. So little decision. Maybe the decision is brave, but something that mixes up the different horns of the dilemma. This is just a proposal, but to discuss about.
Absolutely, thank you. I have my eyes on our audience, one eye towards our physical audience and one eye back in Ethernet land. I mean, one of the more interesting ideas during COVID regarding decision-making that I've heard is the need to get publics accustomed to the fact that we are going to have to engage in a bit of incrementalism or experimental decision-making because we simply don't know exactly what the best decision is to take at that moment. And they're going to have to be tolerant to the fact that we might do a few U-turns or twists or turns. Now, I can see Jane grimacing because we know how that would go over with the public. I completely agree. But if we could somehow, and I think, and Sweden was a country, perhaps an outlier, where people were fairly tolerant of the government's position, even when it didn't seem to coincide with what was happening even next door. So, does incrementalism work? It certainly doesn't work in a 9/11 situation. We're talking about incrementalism when it comes to slow burn, slow emergency. kinds of crises. So I mean, we can talk about whether we can compare different kinds of crises regarding these decision-making dilemmas. Some of them are very COVID specific. We've had to make many decisions over the course of months. We can update our information with new knowledge. We can engage in a bit of incrementalism. But in other crises, that doesn't necessarily work. But I wonder, yes, I see there's one person. Oh, Ronald Bob, there he is. And there's here as well, right. So, Roland, after you.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe a couple of things. So one is, related to your question about incrementalism, I think the Dutch government also tried a little bit to do that, which they called the intelligent approach, which I just got a news feed from our national broadcasting organization. Did not work so much, or was not considered to be intelligent in the end. But it was a sort of attempt to do incrementalism. What I wanted to say is that two more things. One is that we already have a lot of knowledge, right? So it's not that and as Jane Swift was saying, so practicing, but also expertise is already out there a lot. And the government also has all kinds of advisory structures. Each government has, all kinds of advisory panels. We have our SAGE-like system, CDC, or what's called the Outbreak Management Team. But we also had lots of other advisory councils that normally advise on societal issues, on economic policy, on all those kinds of things, which I think could have been mobilized a little bit more than they have been. And they could have created more integrative, interpretive structures to discuss the different aspects of the crisis, which actually did not happen so much. Secondly, I think that nothing is certain. So a lockdown is not certain. I know a story about a building block in the south of the city where I live, in Rotterdam, where especially older migrants live. And during lockdown, they went shopping for each other, because they needed groceries. And 40% of the people in the building block died. So this is death by lockdown. So nothing is certain. And I know this story from a social worker working in that specific area who has a lot of knowledge about the way that people behave on the street. Her knowledge never got into the decision-making structures because of the very dominant sort of safety framing that was there. So organizing these types of sort of layered structures of expertise, of different, and not only numbers, but also stories and experiences, I think is very crucial and especially if we talk about these sort of chronic crises that we have with COVID. It's different in a very acute situations. And of course, COVID had these acute situations, which sort of top-down decision-making were necessary, but given the chronic nature of the crisis, a lot of different stories and information could have been collected that could have informed decision-making a little bit more.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're going to have to group a few questions together since I have an eye on the clock here, and then allow the panel to come back. So Frederick and Wolfgang both had questions.
A reflection that I would invite you to sort of counter on is that part of the reason for having difficulty in knowledge management in government is that the logics of sort of knowledge production is so different. So you get expert communities, which are usually very incremental. They bicker about details and, no more than one expert in a room if you want to sort of get rid of the ambiguity, right? Whereas a political setting is very different. They want answers to questions, and sometimes they ask the wrong questions, and sometimes they ask impossible questions of these expert communities. So do you think there is sort of a fundamental clash here, or is that something we can get over and find solutions to? That would be my question to you.
Great. I hope everyone at home heard that because we sufficiently perfect. And then Wolfgang, if you don't mind.
Yeah, quite honestly, I was wondering why classics on decision-making in a crisis had not been mentioned, such as Graham Allison's book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Essence of Decision, after all, and Irving Janis's book on the groupthink phenomenon, basically referring to the same example. And I could imagine, this is just a hunch, so it's not something very specifically elaborated in my own mind, that we are lacking a particular style and method of research, so far at least, which is, well, process focusing analyses, so source-based process tracing, what they today call process tracing, rather than variable-based research. And of course, sometimes we have to wait until the archives are accessible, but this is primarily a methodological remark. So we are driven by our methods. We all know that that exactly is wrong, but to what extent that affects our current research on the current crises is an important question, it seems to me.
Great. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. And this touches on Dana's third point, actually, is the methods that we use to study this. And actually, one very last question, if I can't resist to Dana, because I also love the multiple streams framework and I'll track this later, we don't have time today, about what do you do when you get rid of the focusing event as a key variable in the streams framework. And creeping crises don't really have a focusing event. They have many little tiny events. So how do you account for that? You and I can discuss that over a virtual dinner or coffee or whatever. But more to the point, Dana, what do you say to practitioners? What can the multiple streams framework help? How can it help answer some of the questions which were brought up here, which were very practical nature, right? So how can that model, that way of understanding crisis response, how can that inform how we organize for decision making, if that's possible? So the panel is welcome to respond. You don't have to respond if you don't want to, but any burning comments, thoughts, and such on the questions, of course, would be appreciated. But if you prefer not to, that's also okay. So who's up first? Who would like to say?
Start?
Yeah, Dana?
So to the questions about how do we update our methods and our models, I think all of these questions are right on point. But unfortunately, the answers themselves are long-term governance challenges, right? So we're not going to be able to say, here's the magic bullet. On the question of what can the multiple streams framework help practitioners understand, maybe it's comforting to know that we have systems in place, and we've had systems in place for a very long time for doing things like bringing in expertise from researchers. And it's not a matter of how do we do this in the general sense of how do we bring this into policymaking decisions. It's more a matter of how do we want to operationalize it in a particular instance, in a particular place. So there are a lot of different practices that can be drawn on. And some other work that I'm doing, the thing that's become very clear looking at community resilience platforms, which is something else I'm looking at, is that a lot of times what people are doing in practice is very much further along than what we're studying as researchers, and we need to catch up to what's happening there and those areas that are doing it well, kind of figure out what the not necessarily best practices, but what the range of possibilities may be that a particular jurisdiction may be able to draw on to create their own unique solution. So that idea of governance platforms, I think, plays in really well here. And then I just wanted to have a sort of a broad comment that adds to the list of dilemmas and trade-offs and pros and cons that were mentioned before, that we really need to keep in mind that this disaster response thinking of how can we be more efficient and effective in responding to the next crisis that may be at hand tends to lead us towards these very procedural kind of answers. When we need that, definitely, but we also need these different techniques for dealing with the new challenges and the surprises. And that can really only be done through a concerted effort at critical thinking skills and not necessarily compliance-based ways of behaving within the organization. So I personally, I understand the difference between a dilemma and a trade-off, but I don't think we're always reflective in which it is that we're dealing with right at the time. So the dilemma may seem like a dilemma at the surface level, but even when you dig a little bit deeper down in, we can see that there are actually more than two choices. There are multiple choices. A lot of these middle choices may actually strike the right balance of a trade-off between the two extremes. So with the example of measurement, which is so important, really important, but we use experience as well, but we also need to respect intuition. We need to expect that sort of, I understand what's happening, I can't put it into words. Whether that's experience that can't be expressed or something a little vaguer like intuition. This is an important factor in, for example, how venture capitalists make their decisions compared to, for example, bankers that want to see all the numbers laid out and all the logic there. And for a really healthy economy, we have to have both these types of people and probably a range of things in between them at all. So I'm kind of in the realm of, if you tell me there's two answers, I'm going to tell you, no, there's more. There are more than two answers for all of this. So the last thing I wanted to add was just, as we're updating our models with this idea of creeping crisis, I think Jane brought up a really good point that we need to update our models for things like social media and this velocity of change. This is so critical, and multiple streams framework does not address this directly, but I think it can be built into it. That's something that needs to be done and understood though. Other similar type of factors are things like polarization, which gets to the point of, can we trust experts? Well, it depends on which experts are your experts, maybe. Anti-elitism, anti-scientific thinking, all these come into play. We can update our models for these. It takes time, and it takes a lot more brains than 1 or 2 or 7. So that's, I think I've covered it all.
Very well put. Thanks, Dana. And I see Jane is either drawing a new structure for knowledge input or the X's and O's of a basketball game tonight, but I can't really tell what's on the board.
No, so the Red Sox are out of the World
Oh yeah,
Series.
true.
So
That's out.
So you're not going to see it, but what I was thinking is, on these creeping crises, we actually know general topic areas, right? So we know climate. We actually knew there were diseases that could jump from continent to continent. We knew in the United States that we actually have underinvested in antibiotics. Like, there's lots of things we knew. We just didn't know how to apply it to the onset of that crisis with all the things that Dana talked about. So what I drew was, for the creeping crisis, could you actually develop a model where leaders of states, governments, have an identification of the creeping crises that are out there, and then building on, I forget who said it, then develop these external advisory groups who are sort of, you need to define what their charge is, but I think, to Dana's point, it has to be models, right, that understand the polarization. So maybe the advisory group itself is working through conflicting opinions. So you have somebody who doesn't believe in lockdowns and somebody who does, right? Or someone, the different risk tolerance, but you develop by topic area these advisory groups, and are not a crisis advisory group, they're an expertise advisory group. And then you have to develop the third thing. How, this is the thing that's really intriguing to me, is like how you draw that out, right? How you call upon those folks and those existing expertise groups and apply them in the moment. Like, what are the right utilization? And if you can backwards map that, right? If you know there's going to be polarization, if you know there's going to be lots of information, that might actually determine the charge you give to these advisory groups. I can send you a picture of my whiteboard. I can only think when I put things on whiteboards.
It's great. We can't see it, but we look forward so do take a picture. And I think you can even take a picture and put it in the chat function, if I know
I probably
this platform is. Well, we're going to have to draw one more point, please.
Just to say that I completely share this suggestion that we probably need in the future some coming back to the research through process tracing, because I think that to learn something from the analytical and also explanatory point of view, we could really be capable to understand the role of agency and their interaction during the process. Because we know, for example, we know that there were structural conditions in every country, so some countries were more prepared, less prepared, but when they had to decide then in that moment, probably there could be a sequence of events and interaction that could have made a difference, and probably also the role of individual stories, background could have made a difference. Think, for example, if in your country different people would have been prime minister in that moment, maybe something could happen. So I think that to think for the future, to better doing research on this could be, otherwise we risk to go ahead with commonplaces, you know what I mean? So I completely agree his proposal. Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, I certainly learned a lot in this panel. I think everyone did. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time, especially our U.S. guests who are up early, or relatively early, to join us, and for taking your time. Hopefully you can, I know we'll see some people again, hopefully we can stay on in the audience or otherwise. So thanks again to our panel members.